Anyway, welcome. I hope you all had a great evening. Yesterday was such a full and exciting day with so much wonderful discussion. Um, these papers did exactly what we uh, hoped that they would do when we commissioned them and invited the researchers to come to be part of this conference, which was encourage this rich cross-fertilization discussion between researchers and practitioners and policymakers about um, technology. about, okay, you okay? Yeah, okay. About, skills and foundation skills and their importance um, to adult success in the world, in all parts of the world. So it was a great discussion. And today, our discussion is going to pick up in some ways about on the last presentation of the day on numeracy. We're going to start with, not quite start, but our focus in the presentations today. We have one presentation on health and fertility, and then two more the rest of our presentations are really going to be a closer look at the PIAAC skills, at literacy and reading, at problem solving, what we've learned about technology and problem solving from a closer look at the problem solving, and then a piece that we're very excited about at AIR, which is our first real attempt to turn the PIAAC tools into something that practitioners can use to guide instruction. So we're going to be talking hearing in the afternoon from folks who are working on research to practice briefs on how to use the PIAAC frameworks to improve teaching and learning. So I hope everybody will be able to stay here and contribute to those discussions. And now, this morning, for all of us to help us think about yesterday, and for those people who weren't here yesterday, we have our second year of an important tradition, which is getting distinguished researchers and thinkers to start the day by providing their reflections on the first day. And we have two speakers this morning, Laura Salganik and Mary Alice McCarthy. And do you guys want to come up? Mary Alice is the Senior Policy Analyst in the Higher Education Policy Program at the New America Foundation. She has, her focus is on the intersection between higher education and workforce development policy and practice. Since she joined New America in the fall of 2013, she has been conducting research on federal higher education policy, which came up quite a lot yesterday, and competency-based education and non-credit education in community colleges. She has a great blog, which you should check out on the New America website, and she's been around for a long. I mean, she was at Octave before, and so she's been a player in many places. We're really glad to have her. And Laura Salganik is, a consultant now and former director of quality at American Institutes for Research. Laura has conducted research on a broad range of education topics, including key competencies, national and international education surveys and statistics, education indicators, and educational attainment. She also participated in international teams of the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development to improve the quality of international education statistics. And she, you know, I've known Laura for years in terms of working on the framework for all the PIAAC work, which is OECD's work on DSECO, defining and selecting key competencies. It's wonderful work. So I'm really delighted they both can be here to talk. Laura's going to begin with a kind of research framework, and then Mary Alice will follow up with more of a policy framework. So thank you both very much for being here.
Well, as someone who has watched the world of adult literacy surveys over many, many years, I'd like to say that it's really a pleasure to be here and see how the dream of PIAAC many, many years ago has really become a reality. Now, is that better? Okay, so the dream of PIAAC has become a reality, and that is just really gratifying to see, and I know it represents a huge amount of hard work on the part of many, many people, many here today and many not here today, including Eugene, and we spoke about him yesterday, and so I again would like to acknowledge what contribution he made to the whole field of international comparisons, dating back even from the very fairly early years when A Nation at Risk came out, which some of us remember, that was based on very poor international comparisons, and now we have better and better international comparisons. So I have three general areas to speak about today. One is I'd like to also recognize some of the achievements of NCES that I think are represented by PIAAC. When you work at a statistical agency, it's really tempting to put all the resources into making a bigger survey, more respondents, more items, better response rate. But if nobody uses the survey, then what's the point of having the survey? And in recent years, I have observed that NCES is really putting more resources into dissemination and outreach, and PIAAC is a great example of how that's really continuing. Another point is that as international surveys started to, well, not exactly proliferate, but increase, and when Dana listed the number yesterday, I was just amazed at how many there were. They've often come at a time when the US also had a survey on the same topic. And it's not difficult to imagine that that's not really, it's not a good position to be in all the time, and it's also not an easy position to get out of. And PIAAC represents the first time when we in the US had a national survey of adult literacy, most recently now, and an international one started, and they were synchronized into one survey. And I think we will see more of that in the future, and that is really an accomplishment that PIAAC has made. Now, thinking more about the papers that were presented yesterday and about the future, this again, many of you are probably also thinking the same thing, but what I keep coming back to is that we've really only scratched the surface with PIAAC. Even the papers yesterday scratch the surface of their own topics. And I can, as someone now trying to think of giving some comments in 10 minutes, I can appreciate that the time was really limited yesterday and that the work is just beginning, but we have really only scratched the surface. And a way that I like to think about it is just go back to basic principles of research. Research 101. I mean, we know we should start with a research question, and I think pretty much all of the researchers yesterday were very disciplined about starting with a research question and then focusing on that question. And most of the research questions had to do with the differences between subgroups in skills and differences between subgroups in how the skills related to labor market outcomes. And then a couple of the papers went in a different direction, looking at the process that generates labor market outcomes. But for the most part, we're looking at subgroup differences for the most part. Then a second general research principle is you should have a theory underlying your research. And when you start with a data set like PIAAC, it's really kind of tempting to just look at the data. And I'd like to really bring people back to the fact that it's really important to have a theory of how skills are generated and how success is generated
in order to make policy recommendations. We all want to make policy recommendations, but if we don't have a theory underlying our analysis that we refer back to for the policy recommendations, then really the policy recommendations are just giving our 2 cents worth and not necessarily with any more basis than anybody who would look at the analysis. So we know that if we're interested in skills and what generates skills and what generates success, we know that it's a complex array of things that generate skills and generate labor market success. And we know that it's not that I know cognitive and non-cognitive isn't a good way to divide skills, but we all kind of know what it means. And if we only have data here about cognitive skills, then the analyses need to include in their theory that we're not looking at everything that generates success. And Sondra mentioned the work that I did. We came up with 3 areas of key competencies, which were acting autonomously, functioning in socially heterogeneous groups, and using tools interactively. And I don't really have time to go into them. If anyone's interested in learning more, you can see me later. But another thing people talk about now is social and emotional skills, or character. These are all different terms that are used to make a fuller picture about what generates success in school and in the labor market, because those are really just different environments that people operate in. And I'll say a little bit about what is called the background questionnaire in PIAAC later, but even if we didn't have measures of those should be recognized when people talk about their theory for what is creating the subgroup differences that we see in PIAAC. And then we also know that it's not just personal characteristics that generate success, particularly in school and in the labor market. So you could have skills, but if you can't get to your job, then you're not going to advance in the labor market. Or if you don't have a home, this is particularly relevant for people at probably the bottom end of the skill distribution, but it's really important for making policy. And a second area, in addition to theory, is knowledge. So I'm a big proponent of knowledge. In addition to the research results about, for example, subgroup differences, especially in international comparisons, if you don't interpret the findings from the perspective of someone with knowledge, like yesterday, the immigrant situation in different countries. If we look at the difference between the skills of immigrants and non-immigrants, you have to know something about the topic of immigrants in the different countries to really be able to make sense of it. Or you could just go off in a direction that won't result in good policy. So you have to understand the phenomena to make the policy. And as the people continue to work on the papers, I would really encourage people to even go out and learn more about the topics, develop the theories more. It's better to have a solid theory and 4 numbers than lots of numbers and no theory. And that's particularly important in this PIAAC world, which is very interdisciplinary. If people aren't used to thinking about a certain area of research, then they're not going to quickly bring that background information to it. They're going to get lost. And so it's really important to situate people in a field before presenting the results. Then the last topic I have here is the future uses of PIAAC. We all know that PIAAC has this background questionnaire that people talk about. And I would like to say here that it's really much, much more than a background questionnaire. I think that term came from NAEP when people talked about people's background, their social and economic background, but this is a full-fledged survey in itself. And it has information about whether people use these, quote, non-cognitive skills at work, cooperation skills, self-organizing, physical skills, influencing skills. It's all there in that survey, as well as very rich information about even how labor markets operate, how people look for jobs, and other outcomes, political efficacy, trust, health. We're going to hear something about health later, I know. So there's really the survey in PIAAC has a lot of information in it where researchers, and this may be the wrong group to be saying this to, but researchers have been saying for a long time, if only we had a real measure of skill. Like, we know we have this relationship between education and volunteering or whatever it is. If only we had a measure of skill. Well, here we actually do have the measure of skill that people who aren't used to having it can include in their research. So you could almost have a separate program or effort just directed at getting people to use the survey. I won't even call it a background survey, the survey part of PIAAC, as well as the assessment. In addition, I would like to encourage people who are primarily interested in the US to look at the international data. It's easy to think that people that are interested in the US, there's so much new data in PIAAC, they want to look at the US data. And people who are interested in comparative work want to look at the comparative data. But one of the really, really valuable things that the international data give us is the ability to understand ourselves better. So if people are really interested in primarily the US and we find some interesting result about the US or some question about the US, they should also look at the international data. That's a major reason why we have these international surveys that we didn't have 30 years ago, is to help us understand ourselves better. And I'll close with that because, again, we have really, really only scratched the surface with PIAAC. And thank you all for the efforts that you've invested in getting below the surface.
Okay, good morning, and it really is a pleasure to be here. My name is Alice McCarthy, and yes, as Sondra said, I'm a senior policy analyst at New America. We dropped our foundation from our name, but I'm very happy to be here because I see many of my colleagues from Octave, from when I was at the U.S. Department of Education, and before that I was also at the U.S. Department of Labor. So it is really exciting to see this increasing focus on the intersection between education and the labor market, and I'm just so excited to see all of this great new research coming out. So thank you to Sondra and to the AIR team for having me here today. I really appreciate the opportunity and the opportunity to review some of the papers, which were really just excellent. Being on the leading edge of this research is really exciting, and watching people make such good use of the PIAAC data, I sort of want to double down on something that Johan Juven, my former boss, said yesterday, which is how much the PIAAC data is part of the policy conversation here in Washington. And that doesn't always happen, you know, and with these policy conversations, usually both sides sort of pick their facts and then develop their policy arguments from that. And they still do that. But having the PIAAC facts out there, the key findings just from the first sort of round of analysis about the 36 million low-skilled adults, about the relationship between credentials, skills, and labor market outcomes has been hugely helpful. So I think that that's very important and should encourage us all. But as Laura was saying, I think we also know that we're still have much to discover with the PIAAC data. And the papers yesterday offered a really exciting peek into some of those new, where additional research can really help us with some of these policy discussions. So I am not a researcher, and I do not have a quantitative background. I do have a PhD, but very much from a qualitative background. But I'm somebody who writes and thinks about policy and spends lots of time sitting in a room with other people who write and think about policy and talk to people who are policymakers. So all of my reactions to these papers are very much through that lens of what are the conversations we're having in these policy circles today, and how do these papers sort of intersect with it. And what I would say is that all of the papers yesterday addressed clearly very important questions that tie directly into some of the big policy fights and discussions, but more like brawls that we're having here in Washington, and that I hear about every day, whether it's credentials, whether it's immigrants, whether it is what is the role of employers and what is the role of work-based learning, and how should we think about it. So that's really great. I would say, so that's fantastic. Then what I say is sort of an overall, so it's wonderful to see the sort of relevance and the pertinence, because it's like, great, bring us more information so we can use more of this and tie this into the policy discussion. At the same time, most of the papers that I read and heard about, I felt like kind of glided over some of the policy stuff. I didn't see any mention, for example, of actual legislation or policies. There wasn't much sort of context for the policy discussion. There were policy recommendations, but, and perhaps that's something that you don't see as your role, and I understand that, but I do think I would encourage the authors to think more about the context of the policy discussion. What are the fault lines? Where are the different sides? What are people thinking about? And what are the major policy levers as well as you think about your recommendations? So with that, I'm going to just quickly talk about each of the panels through that kind of a lens. So the first panel with the 3 papers was just great. And I just want to talk about the 2 first papers as one, because they both sort of look at that relationship between credential skills and labor market outcomes. And I think one of the most exciting findings about PIAAC was that in the United States, at least, it seems that credentials and skills do actually go together. And so credentials do in fact correspond somewhat to skills, because people wondered, are people actually just getting credentials, but they don't correspond to actual skill gain? So it's great to know that they are. Knowing exactly how much they are, the more we know about how much overlap there is, I think the better. But that ties into some very important discussions. But on that point, I sort of want to echo Maureen Conway, who was here yesterday, on the point that I don't think that where that takes us is that we need to focus on more access to education. And from a Washington, D.C. perspective, I would say sort of, the issue of access to education, to higher education, has been sort of asked and answered. We've all seen the returns to post-secondary credentials. There's sort of no question that everyone needs to get some sort of post-secondary credential. But the fight in Washington is about what are the outcomes of higher education, and how do we think about, from a policy perspective, what role should outcomes play in our policies? And those outcomes, of course, bring us back to the question of cost bring us to the question of economic returns to those credentials. So I would say to those papers, the conclusions that are coming to make those papers even more relevant to the discussion is, how does this data help us think about outcomes? Maureen sort of raised the point that maybe higher education shouldn't be thinking about outcomes because it doesn't really influence outcomes. I would disagree with that, but I mean, I would encourage you not to avoid the outcomes discussion, because that's where the real policy discussion is. The other thing that I wanted to sort of talk about was both of the papers address credentialism and the issue of credential inflation. And credentials are such a hot topic in Washington these days. You can't swing a dead cat in this town without bumping into some meeting on credentials, and how are we gonna, what are we doing about credentials and everything else. But the conversation isn't so much about credentialism, but there is a lot of concern about credential inflation. And the papers both sort of make the case that there's not any evidence of credential inflation. And I would just say, and again, this is coming from somebody who's not a quantitative researcher, so I may be missing something important here, maybe showing my limitations here, but I didn't find that very convincing. In particular, the idea that because the returns to credentials are so strong, we must not be having credential inflation. It seemed to be that the hypothesis was, if there was a lot of credential inflation, we would see a lot of people out there in the labor market with credentials but not good returns. But I think what we're seeing instead, and what some other analyses have pointed us to, particularly a paper by Burning Glass, some research put out by Burning Glass last year about credential creep, which is what they call it, is that credential inflation takes a different form. And what it does is it makes it harder for people to get into the labor market and to get to jobs that previously they could get to relatively easily or in shorter time. It increases the cost of labor market entry by increasing the credential requirements. And so I didn't see that in either of the papers, and I think it's an important one to address because it's a very different kind of problem. Which brings me to the last point about the credential discussion is, the sociological literature on credentialism, I mean, is all super interesting. I don't think, here in Washington, though, the conversation around credentials isn't so much of do we want them, but how do we make them work better? How do we build better credentials, transparent credentials? Educational credentials are the most opaque credentials out there. I mean, what is a degree? What's behind that? Everyone has the same kind of degree. There's very little transparency to them, and there's very little depth to them. So there's a lot of discussion about how do we build digital credentials, the whole badging discussion, how do we build transparent credentials, and I would encourage the authors of both those papers to think about where they sort of fall in that debate. Then finally, the third paper of that panel, which looks at the persistence of skill gaps between first-generation college goers and multi-generation college goers, was just great. I mean, what an important finding. What a distressing finding. And there, I would say that's the kind of nugget that makes its way into policy discussion, sometimes in ways that make you cringe, okay? Because there's lots, I mean, that finding raises so many questions, so many difficult questions about what is happening in college, and also about what is happening in the labor market. And one of the things I want to encourage the authors to think about is they talk about, you address very nicely that this does raise questions about which kinds of institutions help close these gaps better than others, but it also raises questions about what kind of skills really matter for career success. And maybe they're not the ones people are learning in college, or maybe they are the ones people are learning in college, but they're not the ones we're measuring. So anyway, I would encourage that. The next panel then was about immigration and skills, and I just thought it was a great paper and very exciting and made some really interesting comparisons and provided some very helpful dimensions to think about policy, which was the integration, skill development, and admission policy. So thank you for that. I look forward to that paper coming out, and I think, again, it's like really nicely organized for a policy discussion. And then the last panel had two super interesting papers. The one about the one about skill loss. I went out last night. We had our holiday party. I heard somebody talking about Washington does too many holiday parties. It's true. It's true. Gosh, and it went on forever. But we ended up having a long discussion about that paper, so I can't wait for that to come out, because another big area of policy focus is how do we get employers to invest in training? What's the case? How do we make the argument? And this idea around skill loss and what it means about our educational investments and tying those together is really interesting, and I'm very excited about that. And then finally, the last paper that looks at adult education, adults in higher education and their returns, again, I thought was very helpful, right on target. We're constantly talking about non-traditional learners, adult learners. How do we help them better? How do we support a culture of lifelong learning? The key variable there is openness. And I would just, again, openness can mean many things. We have a very open higher education system in the United States. It doesn't necessarily mean good things for our students. Students are open to go to institutions that charge them a whole lot of money for credentials that aren't necessarily very good. So the finding, for example, that the ISCED 5B folks didn't do very well in the United States might have a lot to do with precisely the open access nature of a lot of our post-secondary vocational programs. So, I'd like to see a lot more, again, that kind of, the way the immigration paper broke things down into dimensions, I could see openness, like what are we talking about? What are the dimensions of openness? And what are the trade-offs between them? So those are just really some preliminary thoughts. These were all great papers. They're exciting. I can't wait for them to come out so that maybe I can blog about them. And thank you for doing them.